evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Sneha Koshy and you're watching Beyond the Headline. Well, I am with my colleagues and this is the Mirror Now office. 4 of us are holding 5 cell phones. If you ask why, remember there's a lot of debate, lot of discussions around differential pricing, particularly when it comes to cab aggregators. Before we get into a debate with experts trying to understand what's really happening, here's a reality check. 4 of us, colleagues at Mirror Now, are going to try and do a reality check with 4 phones. We have 3 Androids and 2 iOS or Apple phones. Let's just see what's the differential pricing, or if at all there is any differential pricing. Well, same location. All of us have typed in. This is the Times of India office, as well as the destination is DLF Promenade. All of us. 5 phones, same location. Now, let's look at the pricing. In one of the first cab aggregator apps, for a Mini, I'm getting 514. Himanshu-ji, what does it show for you?
Sneha, it's actually quite telling, and the variations are actually quite revealing for me as well. It is 497 on one of the apps, and on the other app, I'm seeing a price of 480. Let me tell our viewers that a couple of minutes back, it was close to 600 on both apps, 570 and 590. So it's a massive change. The fluctuations are there, but even now, so I have 2 Android phones in my hand, and both are showing a significant variation, which is close to 20 rupees on the same app and Android devices.
So same app, 2 different phones, both Androids, in fact 3 Androids, 3 different prices. Now let's just see how different is it when it comes to the Apple. So how different is it for you?
Okay, so this is the iPhone device, and the pickup location is similar. I do have the mic. So the pickup location is the Times of India, and the drop location, as you have already mentioned, is DLF Promenade. And the prices for the same for the Ola Mini, it shows around 530, while it was around 490 for the Android device. And at the Apple device, it clearly shows 530. And we have also sought the response of the Ola and Uber as well, as to what exactly is their response, because the ministry for the very first time they have sought a detailed response from the cab aggregators.
So this time we are taking the second cab aggregator app, and in this case the same location, the state starting point, the same ending point. It's showing 516 rupees for me. Nikhil,
Okay, so for
you?
iOS device, Uber Go shows around 540 rupees. 540
rupees. And Divyank, what is it for you?
Even for 2 iOS devices, I'm a first-time Uber user. I don't use Uber regularly. It's 511 for me, which is the cheapest version, which is the sedan. And the Uber Go, which is the equivalent of Mini, is showing me 513.
All right, so here it is. A very small team, all at the same location, prime time. This is right now, somewhere close to 7:15 in the evening. All of us have done a reality check. 5 phones, 2 iOS, 3 Androids, totally different rates, varying from 50-60 rupees to even a 20 rupees difference. So ladies and gentlemen, from the newsroom where we did a reality check to the studio where we have experts with you. But what does this essentially mean? From the reality check that we did, it essentially shows different prices for different models of cell phones. And it's of course different rates for Androids vis-a-vis the iOS. But it's not just about Android versus iOS. In fact, consumers being charged differently for same locations, even on different Android models, as well as different prices for same location on different iOS mobiles. But very, very intriguing here. For now, a central government body has issued notices to cab aggregators Ola and Uber seeking their response. And notice has been issued by the Consumer Rights Watchdog, Consumer Protection Authority, over differential pricing on iOS as well as Android. Commuters have complained of disparity for identical rights. Centre seeks responses from the cab aggregators. Now, well, Uber in a response has said they do not set prices based on a rider's phone manufacturer, and that they look forward to working with the Central Consumer Protection Authority to clear up what they have called any misunderstanding. Well, we are yet to hear about any of the response from Ola, particularly after the notice issued by the central government's body. So what is this about? Are you being taken for a ride? Is this also about consent versus algorithms? Consent as in the mandatory access permissions you agree as a precondition to use these apps versus the algorithms that then play out? Or is it something totally different? To help us understand this better, I'm being joined at this point by Professor Bejon Kumar Misra, who is a consumer policy expert. Lloyd Mathias, who's a business executive and independent director. Shri Parthasarthi, who's an independent director for Wiz Mazhars and technology expert, as well as Anuj Bali, who is a founder for Anback Advisors. Thank you very much for joining us, all four of you. Well, Lloyd Mathias, let me straight come to you at this point. I believe you have some explanation for these differential pricings, or at least, and it's interesting, Mr. Lloyd Mathias. It's very interesting because it's not just about Android versus iOS. Because the reality check that we did is also showing different prices for two sets of mobile phones that are using Android as their basis, and even differential pricing for iOS set of phones. So it's not just Android versus iOS. How do you explain something like this?
Thanks, Sneha. I think a couple of points. While, prima facie, this seems completely unfair and unjust, I think you have to recognize two aspects. I think one is that differential pricing or bias in pricing has always been a reality, right? Forget about the digital world. In the analog world, right? You can, do the same surgery for the same patient in an AIIMS hospital. You go to a private hospital and you possibly pay 3 times as much. A domestic help in a tonier part of town will possibly charge you twice as much for doing the same set of housework than in a less affluent part of town. You go to a sari store and just judging by the vehicle you come out of, the salesman is likely to walk you to a more expensive section than to the more commonplace section. It's just that in the earlier legacy world, a lot of this was based on human judgment. Right now, there's an algorithm that's making these decisions. Now, the morality notwithstanding, I think you have to recognize that pricing at some level is a business decision, right? And for every time a business is pricing itself slightly higher or seemingly discriminatory, the consumer can vote with his feet and vote out. We are all obviously upset about the fact that it's a higher price. What if I tell you that there are cab aggregators that have special pricing for military veterans, lower pricing, special pricing for students, lower pricing, special pricing for senior citizens, lower pricing? Will that seem unfair? Well, that's a reality, right? Military veterans have served the country and they deserve a better pricing. So I think a small degree of pricing
Lloyd
variation
Mathias,
and fluctuation
in that, it's
is
a very
business's
different.
prerogative.
Mr. Lloyd Mathias, what you have
Yes.
said is a very totally different set of principles that's involved, because in that case, you are possibly giving a lower rate to a particular targeted population for certain reasons, and that's definitely discretionary power of any private company to do so. That is definitely their prerogative. Here, that's not what's playing out. What's playing out is 4 random people with the same profile, I mean, we 4 were journalists for that matter, who did this reality check, across the Android and the iOS, had differential pricing varying from 20 rupees to 50 rupees. Some said even more. We don't have that on record, but we have that with us as well. We saw that as well. So how does this then get justified?
Sneha, for the simple reason that with that small pricing fluctuation, a business is able to maximize its profit and also at some points discount pricing to the more deserving. I'm not saying that the Uber and the Olas do that, but I'm saying a business gets a sense of variability. That as opposed to some Babu in South Block taking a call on pricing. Then we'll be back to the same debate about salted caramel is janta and caramelized caramel is for the affluent. Now, do we want that kind of pricing uniformity? Or do we want businesses to use their judgment? A business that seems unfair and prices high will lose customers over time. If either Uber or Ola is doing it and an iPhone consumer feels discriminated, he's welcome to move out. He can take an alternate ride-hailing service. So I think over time, the market corrects itself. But just assuming that there has to be some regulator sitting and deciding on pricing will make a complete mockery of the free market.
Professor Bejon Kumar Misra, do you agree with what Lord Mathias is saying? I mean, let's look at what he's saying. If you look at it, he's saying every private company, everybody has the right to make a differential treatment in terms of who pays how much. If that's the argument, and let's be fair, 20 rupees, 30 rupees, 2 rupees, 3 rupees, 10 rupees at a given point is not a huge amount of difference of money for some of the people in India, at least. I can't say for all, but at least, for the upper middle class, that's not a big amount of a big deal. But when that money comes in the larger picture, it's huge amounts of profit for the company. How do you look at that then?
See, Sneha, the most important issue we all need to understand is why did the government agree to bring the Consumer Protection Act in the year 1986? And why did the government amend and bring a new law in 2019? Because to protect the rights of the consumers and to make sure that the businesses practices ethical practices and not unfair trade practice. Now, this is a fit case where there is lack of transparency. We are not able to understand why it is happening, how it is happening. My panel member is talking about that they are making certain profit. We are not against profit. All consumers want that the business entity should survive and sustain based on a very realistic profit on their investment, but not profiteering, not adopt such unethical practices which tantamounts to unethical practices, unfair trade practices. So we want to make sure that the business entity comes out with very valid, evidence-based kind of arguments and justifications in terms of ensuring that they're making a reasonable profit in terms of their investment. So my contention is very simple. Instead of the regulator issuing a notice, the regulator should seek their books of accounts and should understand how the financial mechanism is working in the interest of the consumer. As I said,
but I don't
against
even
profit.
know in today's era, can a regulator just go ahead and ask for the financial statements or account? That itself sounds like a huge breach.
No, there is a law which empowers the regulator to ensure that ethical practices are adopted, and wherever they feel that there is any kind of an unethical practice or unfair trade practice, they can start an investigation. So why is there a show cause notice? There should be an investigation.
That's where I guess they have sought a statement from Ola and Uber have said that they do not indulge in something like that. But Lloyd Mathias, I think you have to make a point in response to what Professor Bejon Kumar Misra is saying.
Thanks, Sneha. Just a quick point, and I respect Professor Misra a lot. Just the point is, who determines what is profiteering and what is profit making, right? Are we going to determine that anything above 10% or 15% is profiteering? So who determines the cutoff? And if a business does not have the variability to price itself according to market reality, it'll be out of business, right? Like I said, some regulator will take a call and say that you cannot price so and so. This is a fixed band pricing. And fixed band pricing very often works against the interest of the consumer. I think if you recognize that a bit of flexibility is what helps a business make sure it stays in business, and more importantly, is only fair on the consumer, right? In the analog world, we did that. In the algorithmic world or in the digital world, the algorithms are helping us do it far more fairly.
Far more fairly. Bejon,
Absolutely,
Professor Bejon,
it's
a minute to you before I go to the other panelists.
Depending on peak hour traffic.
Sneha, I just want to say that we bring a law to bring a regulator. And why do we bring a regulator? To have an oversight, to ensure that it is ethical and it is a fair practice which is going on. And that's why we bring a regulator. We are not saying that it should be overwhelming. We don't want to go back to the, Inspector Raj. We don't want that kind of an environment to come back to India.
Okay.
But we definitely want a regulator to have an oversight.
Allow me, gentlemen, allow me to just get the other two panelists also into this picture. Shri Parthasarathi, let me get you in at this point. Help us understand what's happening. Because as Lord Mathias said, and he used a couple of words, he said the discretionary power of corporates, wisdom, their judgment, flexibility. But listen, at the end of the day, all of these things are about algorithms. Help our viewers to understand how does this function. when you talk about algorithms, how closely it is linked to the permissions, the mandatory permissions that one gives in their app. And if that is what links it to algorithms, then one really doesn't have any choice, because if you don't give those permissions, you don't get to use those apps.
Thanks, Neha. I think what I would like to do is I'd like to draw a balance between what Lloyd Mathias talked about and what Professor Mishra talked about. Because today, if you take the transportation sector, everything is based on supply and demand and how they primarily manage it. And there are numerous algorithms in terms of demand,
Sure.
in terms of usage, in terms of availability. For example, in this particular case, as we look at Uber, if four of you had primarily logged in with your ID, this afternoon I basically tried this in terms of using the same ID on multiple apps, right? Multiple phones, Android, iOS, and another phone, and I got different prices. So one thing that I'd like to deflate is that essentially it is preferential pricing and other thing, and it was the same location from same location to same another thing. So I think there is some kind of challenge that is happening in terms of the technology usage. Possibly they're thinking iOS user is possibly a little more affluent, and so that we should charge them better. But at the same time, if the
No,
pricing is
here's the
based
thing. No,
on
Mr.
demand,
Parthasarathi, what's interesting? No. Let me just allow me to interject you at this point, because there's an important finding that you mentioned, and it's interesting what you said, because the same ID across phones, across models, gives different pricing. We're not talking about preferential treatment or preferential pricing. We're talking about differential pricing, because here's what we found. There have been cases where the pricing for iOS has been less than that of Android. While there's a lot which is being said that iOS users are being charged more than the Androids, there have been cases which we could record, and it's up on your screens as well, where actually it showed lesser for iOS as well. So it's not really the case of preferential for sure.
it is not preferential, but I think where I look at it is the same user logging into multiple phones from the same location in, I think, just a millisecond difference, and essentially showing a differential pricing or a different pricing, I think essentially is wrong. But however, if it is based on usage, it is based on supply and demand, it is based on what you call as the surge pricing and those kind of things, I think definitely something needs to be looked at. That is something that should be allowable from a free market perspective. But at the same time, if I look at it, one, while we allow free market, I think what we really need to go to the crux of the situation is most of these particular organizations did predatory pricing when they entered the market. So they captured market share, and now they can pretty much charge whatever they want. So in that particular case is where I think the regulator comes in, where they can put some level of caps in terms of consumer protection to manage that. But at the same time, when it comes to demand pricing and all things, to allow innovation, to allow cab drivers to make a little more if they're standing in traffic and those kind of things, that is going to be very important. And there are a few other factors too. If they start basically looking at other parameters which they can capture from the web, if you're in a personal situation, you're in a medical emergency, those kind of things, and if they're starting to see, hey, you are a person that I can possibly fleece, and if I start combining a lot of that particular information into the algorithm, then I think it becomes a very different pricing structure, and where the consumer protection should definitely rule very heavily in terms of what they're doing. And I think investigation is something that I would say not something that I will look at. I would say transparency in how they basically charge is going to be important, and how they apply these algorithms so that people feel that whatever is being charged is fair and balanced, and that is what I think is very important.
That's very interesting. Lloyd Mathias, you want to come in very quickly at this point, because I have to ask you this. We just heard Mr. Parthasarathi, and what is he saying? He's saying if there's surge pricing, if it is based on supply and demand, then there are also concerns about it. But he's also made a very interesting point, and that is, where does one have the cutoff point? I mean, so if you are getting consent for basic permissions, that are mandatory, without which you cannot use the app. Now, there are some users who have actually gone on social media to say that when the battery gets low, prices kind of spiral. I don't have a response to that. Uber and Ola have not explained this. We have not been able to verify this as well. But there are several people who have gone ahead and even claimed this with screenshots and so on and so forth. Now, these are sensitive informations and you can't withhold them because that's mandatory to go and access these apps.
So, Sneha, I believe that transparency is important. I believe morality and a company playing fair is absolutely important because that determines its long-term sustainability of the company. But like I said, I still expect the company to have flexibility and variability and sometimes make the differentiations, like when it comes to search pricing. Now, just getting specifically into it, let's say something like an iPhone user, you know that an iPhone typically would cost all features equal, roughly 20% higher. So it's a fair assumption that any digital provider would make, assuming that an iPhone user is far more affluent. Or if you look at any e-commerce player, they know your shopping history. If they know that you're someone who shops for premium products, it's more likely they're going to show you those kind of products. Now, that kind of nudge can be either seen as discriminatory or can be seen as a better understanding based on consumer insights. And I think we have to recognize that flex in business, right? Part of being an iPhone user is the flaunt value of saying, hey, I use an iPhone user, and there's a certain flaunt because of its premium pricing. Now, the next thing we're going to say is the regulator should say, why should an iPhone be priced 20% higher than a similar spec phone? And then we go back to exactly what I think Professor Misra mentioned. Then we go back to a license inspector Raj, right? So some Sarkari Babu will be making the call saying, hey, caramelized popcorn is expensive and therefore has to attract a higher tax, and salted popcorn should be cheaper. And where is it going to stop? So do we want to get back to that era, or do we want to be fair? But you have to understand that most companies would like to be moral because they want to stay in business. And they do not want to be seen cheating the customer or what is called price gouging.
They may not want to be seen cheating their customers, but in the world where algorithms define a lot of transactions, it's also interesting to see what defines cheating, because that also has changed. I'll get Professor Bejon to respond to that. But first, let me get in Anuj Bali. Anuj Bali, here's my question to you. I mean, an average Samsung phone would cost somewhere in the US, say, $349. And this is average selling price for the first half of 2024. Apple or the iOS, would cost somewhere around $942. Does this have anything to do with how the corporates look at customers, particularly those who use their services on their phones?
So Sneha, see, from a company standpoint, what is important is profitability and the value that you give to the customer. At the end of the day, differential pricing is something that has been going on since time immemorial, right? Today, the times have changed. Data is the new file. You know what is there in the pockets of your customers, right? You know their income levels, you know where they're from, you know about their families, everything, we are just making an assumption that it is because of the value of the phone that you're being charged higher, but probably it is deeper than that. So the exchange of data might not just be happening while you are accessing the Uber app. It might be something even deeper than that, and the exchange of data could be even deeper than that. So, from a very capitalistic standpoint, or from the standpoint of a company, I would say that if it is delivering value to a customer and it is charging higher, or even if it is a differential pricing, I think that is absolutely fine. But in terms of the long-term impact of it, I think the brand value does go down because customers do not like being cheated. And that is something that Uber and Ola and all of these companies should look into, because if the customer does not come back, and if they shift to competitors like Blue Smart and all, that's where the impact lies, I feel.
Let me just get in again, Lloyd Mathias. Lloyd Mathias, and here's the thing. He spoke about other cab aggregators. We don't know what the situation with other cab aggregators is, because Ola and Uber seem to be in the spotlight right now. They have the larger chunk, the majority chunk of the market. So we don't know what is it with the other cab aggregators right now. The notice has also gone to Ola and Uber. Lloyd Mathias, you also spoke about cheating, and so did Anuj Bali speak about cheating. But cheating gets a very different connotation in today's era, because a customer gets to know that he's cheated, he or she is being cheated only once that's exposed, which gets even more challenging in today's world of algorithms. And again, as I said, this is sub judice. It is going to be probed whether Ola and Uber really do something like that. That's for another thing. But largely, if you're talking about cheating, it's a totally different era.
Yes, Sneha. I think companies do not want to get into a situation where they lose consumer trust, right? The moment they begin to see as being unfair or kind of, price gouging, right? Effectively really kind of profiteering at the expense of the customer, they will lose trust and long term they'll be out of the business. Having said which, I do believe that the market has its own correction mechanisms. If over time people believe that one cab aggregator or one food aggregator is pricing basis device, they will gradually move to another, right? And that business will actually, will see the impact. Similarly, if people believe that having a certain brand of phone gets them priced higher, they're welcome to kind of switch into other brands. The market has its own corrective mechanism because businesses want to stay relevant and want to stay sustainable, and consumers want to get the best price deal. But getting needless activism and saying that a regulator should be controlling the pricing dynamics, I think that's unfair. Privacy, important. Transparency, important. Morality, important. But flexibility of pricing to a business to keep it sustainable is equally important. The moment we get into a regulatory system, my worry is that things could get far worse. Who is to determine that a consumer traveling to DLF Promenade, which is a swanky mall, versus a consumer going to a neighborhood market? One is affluent and one is not. That's not a fair judgment. But digital knowing the data helps to make these judgments. And therefore businesses are increasingly using some of these tools as opposed to applying human biases.
Absolutely same.
Yeah, so I'm saying that it could be various factors. If 5 of you were starting from the same point, maybe that caused a small jump into a kind of surge pricing mode, right? So somebody got that benefit. I'm saying I don't have the answers. I believe algorithms are programmed with some degree of human bias, but over time they will even out. But yes, there is a reality. I think there is some answering to do.
Shri Parthasarthi, you've been raising your hands. You want to make a point. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think when an algorithm is basing certain decisions based on generally available information, which are based on business parameters, I think then I agree that it is fair pricing. But when it is based on certain aspect related to affluence, the situation of the person and all of those particular things, then I think it is exploitation of that particular situation. And to Lloyd Mathias, where he said, oh, if you are being charged more if you have an iPhone, then go and change the phone. Then tomorrow I basically go to some other app and some other app is primarily doing it. Do I basically have an iOS phone, an Android phone, and something else? I think that is grossly a wrong suggestion in terms of having a different phone. If I basically have a phone, just because I get down from a nice car, that doesn't mean that the restaurant or the hotel can charge me more in terms of the food. Right? I think it is based on certain things. And those parameters that you're looking at saying that, hey, I can give you a valet parking or I can give you something else on the meal and charge you a little more and being very transparent on that, or I can basically get your cab in less than 5 minutes compared to another person who's possibly waiting for 13 or 14 minutes is fair. But essentially what we are doing here is we are going down into the aspect of privacy where we are starting to capture information related to the situation of the person, other parameters that we are capturing from their phone and other things that we are looking at. And then we are basically applying that to an algorithm, because if two people were if the same person is logging up on 2 phones, why should there be different pricing? In a millisecond, there can't be that much difference in pricing. So I think there is something that is definitely that needs to be looked into. And I think answering and transparency is what. It's not about being regulated, because the fair market is very important, as Lloyd Mathias said. But I think at the same time, certain aspects related to cap or in terms of some of these particular pricing or surge pricing, so the consumer is protected and not being fleeced in some of these particular situations.
Mr. Parthasathi, also would you make a point? I mean, we are of course discussing cab aggregators, but in today's era, the way businesses are being run, the way businesses, transactions, interactions, all of this are being propelled, what we are discussing isn't restricted to cab aggregators either.
Very, very true. It is not restricted only to the cab aggregator. It is almost in the entire transportation sector, because that is what it is. That's the way they run the algorithm. If four of us basically log in and say, I would like to go to a particular location, then what really happens is that the price of that particular air ticket or whatever it is starts increasing. And the moment you log off and give it a 12-hour break and come back, the prices drop again, because the algorithm now suddenly starts feeling that there's not that much of a demand. So I think it is there. And I think with AI and everything, that all of your devices are listening to you. Today you say something, automatically what is going to happen is tomorrow, I think it is going to essentially be sending you something on Google or something else. I'm sure if Uber is listening to it tomorrow, possibly if I go in and try to basically put in my for my Uber cab, either I may get a discount or I may get a significant pricing that this guy is basically hammering me on television, right? I think those are kind of things that should not be allowed.
Okay. Professor Bejon, please go ahead. Make your point, Professor Bejon. You've been having your hands up for a while now. Apologies for that. Please go ahead.
My friend Lloyd has contradicted himself in many places. My friend, you please try to understand, what we are trying to say is we are not against technology. As consumers, we are in favor of technology, which is in favor of the consumer. But please tell us how you are working it out. Be transparent. And Professor Parthasathi has very clearly mentioned it in terms of technology can be a big enabler to the consumer. We love competition. As consumers, we want competition to be there. But at the same time, you can't say there cannot be a regulator. There has to be a regulatory oversight. While we allow people to be creative and be able to do business in an ethical manner, but we will not allow anybody to become monopolistic and trying to manipulate the technology to their favor. It has to be always consumer-centric. What we are all the time trying to tell the regulator is, don't issue show cause notices for heaven's sake. Get to action. Take action against people. Take such deterrent action against people who are gorging, who are actually, misusing technology in their interest, in their business interest. We want business to prosper and sustain and make India a good market for the world to come and invest. But we don't want those people to come here to grudge money, to mislead the consumer, to cheat the consumer, because what we are talking about today in the evening comes within the definition of unfair trade practice. Full stop. It comes under the definition. And please look at it very carefully in the law.
Very strong words from Professor Bejon. He's going ahead and saying this comes nothing short of unfair trade practices. I mean, just to say it again on this show, that Ola and Uber have a very different version. And there is, their responses have officially been sought as well. But nonetheless, unfair trade practices is what Professor Bejon is alleging.
Yeah, I think the one simple question I have for Professor Bejon is, how does one tell everything to the government? Do you want every aggregator to open up his algorithm, say this is the basis of pricing, and therefore we can do a 10% basis cost? A cost up pricing then doesn't make any sense. Then you're again opening your books, opening your trade secrets, and all the business differentiator is out. The same example I would use with Professor Bejon is, why is a heart surgery at an AIIMS costing X, whereas you go to a private hospital and you're paying 2.5 times, right? The cost of a surgery, the cost of is identical. Why does the consumer pay 2.5 different times, right? Do you want the government to regulate the price and say that every hospital in India has to have this price, right? That again is a perfectly valid thing, right? It's the same product. It's the same product at two different locations. Why is the consumer paying a different price? I wish Professor Bejon can enlighten us.
I'll tell you. You gave a very good example of healthcare. Today we don't have a regulation in healthcare. Do you know that? We've been fighting for this for the last 20 years, that there should be a regulator in healthcare. We have to ensure that they don't kind of profiteer out of healthcare. Today there is such an inflationary trend in the healthcare only because we don't have a law. But fortunately we have Consumer Protection Act as a law which governs all the commercial activities in our country. And we were able to bring it in 1986. Now we have changed it in 2019. Let's look at the law carefully. Let's understand the law. Why is that law existing? You just threw the regulator out of the window. No, we need a regulator. Please try to understand, Roy. It's very important. Even in the telecom sector, you know it very well. We have
Okay.
TRAI.
Okay.
In the insurance sector, we have IRDAI. Why do we have these regulators in place?
Okay.
We have these regulators because we want business to prosper.
I think Lloyd Mathias as well as Bejon Misra, both of you are raising some very important questions to very important perspectives, and that's what we really require to understand the gamut of concerns around what's also being increasingly discussed. Anuj Bali, let me just come into you at this point. Anuj Bali, as somebody who uses cab aggregators, as somebody who has said you have concerns about it may be much deeper than what many of us think about how data is accessed. At this point, what is your biggest concern?
Well, so I was hearing out Professor Mishra as well as Mr. Lloyd. See, there has to be a balance, right? There has to be a regulation. There has to be a process to see how the data is being exchanged. But, at the same time, I feel that you cannot demotivate the entrepreneurs to go for innovation because, oftentimes what we've seen in the past in India's history also is that when we've tried to regulate too much, I think those sectors have not really picked up that fast. So I think the entrepreneurs also like to have a free play to a large extent. But, not regulating is also not a very good option. I feel that there has to be a balance between the two. But too much regulation might just kill the motivation for most of the companies. That's what I feel.
Sneha, can I just...
All right.
Sneha, can I come in?
Okay, go ahead.
Hey, Anuj, you have said appropriately. I appreciate you saying this. The youngsters, the startups must understand that we don't want to kill creativity. We want innovation to come, to delight the customer, to create that value. But please tell the customer and understand that value. Explain it in simple words to them. Make technology, make innovation so competitive that the consumer feels that wow factor in them. They should feel that wow factor. They should never feel cheated.
Okay.
Now here we are feeling cheated. So this is the time when the youngsters like you all, the startups should come out with solutions which will enable the consumers to understand the value creation.
Okay, I mean, it's also interesting, Professor Bejon, because while some are claiming that they feel cheated, the corporates are saying that they have not done something like that. So if it's about innovation algorithms, it's also about how really it plays out and how the twain should meet in today's era. Shri Parthasarthi, I think I'll leave you for the concluding remarks.
Sure. I think I look at the example that Lloyd Mathias gave in terms of AIIMS versus some other hospital. And I think the example is not appropriate in this particular situation. So if I were to go into AIIMS, if I were to come in a bullock cart, and if I were to come in a Ferrari, and if I was going to be charged differently, then that is the example that you're primarily using here. But however, if I'm basically going to AIIMS or I'm going to a premium hospital, obviously there's going to be a price difference on that. Compared to a Uber or somebody who's providing a premium chauffeur services, and if I'm going to them, they are going to charge differential. So, but as here, what we are talking about is the same provider on multiple devices for the same consumer, providing different kind of information. And essentially that's where it is, as I said before. And Anuj said it right. You have to strike a balance, but the balance has to be based on what are those generally available parameters, business parameters that you can base these algorithms on, and what are those particular parameters which go beyond privacy of the particular consumer, which goes into the aspect of exploitation, and which is what we need to balance, and which is what the transparency is going to be very important.
Well, Professor Bejon Kumar Misra, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for joining us. Lloyd Mathias, thank you very much for your very, very important perspectives. Shri Parthasarthi, thank you for your time in breaking this down for us. And of course, Anuj Bali, thank you for joining us and your perspective. To the gentlemen, you brought in much into this debate. And of course, all eyes on how Uber and Ola are going to respond to the notices that have been served to them. Customers, consumers, definitely watching it all. Time for a very short break.